Well, now in our second session together, we're going to begin our look at the exegetical process. And our first area to focus upon will be what I call stanza analysis. Stanza analysis. Poetical genre exhibits a unique type of structure that is not inherent within the epistolary and narrative genres. And we've discussed this. We discussed this in class already, and I noted this in the previous video for our course. But you have to understand that poetical genre is different. The way it's structured is different than the way the epistles are written and the way the narrative genres have been written by the authors that God inspired. So when beginning the process of exegetical analysis for the poetical passages that are written in the style of poetry, the exegete must understand the nature of the structure of poetry. And you got to be able to identify the various components, the structural components, as they appear in any given passage or poetical passage. So you got to be able to analyze the structure, but you got to be able to visually see it first thing before you can analyze it. You got to be able to visually see it. And remember, I told you that I've made a point of this, that in certain versions of the Bible, that structure is not apparent. It's not visually displayed, like in a King James version, for example. It doesn't visually appear to you on the page. So you have to use a version of the Bible that does. And for our purposes, the examples that you will see, that I will work with in class, that you'll see in the videos, will be all from the English Standard Version, because that version is one among others that does place the text in this visual framework so that you can clearly see the structure. Now, one of the examples I list here is Psalm 1. If you look at the picture right below where we've been discussing, Psalm 1, you've read this most likely many times, but the way you see this is important. The way you need to be able to look at this and be able to discover these structural components. And in our previous class session, we actually looked at some of these things that I'm going to talk about a little bit more in detail in this video. But I wanted to give you a little bit of overview last time that we had class together about these things. And so when you look at this, you see that there are lines here, lines of text. Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, nor stands in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of scoffers. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law he meditates day and night. So you see those lines, those lines of text. And so you want to be able to visually see that one line is separated from another line by a visual physical space. It's what we call indented. The second line is indented. The first line appears to the left. The second line is indented. So line number 1 is blessed is the man. Line number 2, who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, is indented. And then line number 3, nor stands in the seat of, or in the way of sinners, that is over to the left side of the margin. The next one that's indented is line number 4, nor sits in the seat of scoffers. And usually it's like that. You'll have one line to the left and the next line indented. However, sometimes it doesn't follow that pattern. If you look at the end of verse 3, the line that says, in all that he does, he prospers. What comes next? The next line is in the verse 4, the wicked are not so. So those lines are not indented. The second one after is not indented. Sometimes that happens as well. So you want to be aware of these things and visually try to perceive the way these lines appear, because this is the appearance of poetry. another thing that you may notice here is in between verses 1 and 2, there is a gap between verses 1 and 2 and verses 3 and 4. Do you see the physical gap there? And then you see another physical gap between verse 4 and the beginning of verse 5. So you want to notice the indentions. You want to notice how lines are put together, how they're formed, and you want to know which ones are indented, which ones are not indented, and you want to realize or perceive the gaps, the visual gaps that appear between sections of verses in the poetical passages. Those are important visual clues. And again, if you look at this psalm in the King James Version, you won't see these visual clues. You won't see them at all. And so you want to be aware of them. You want to be aware of how this operates. Why? Because that's part of its structure. Those physical gaps and indentions help define visually the structure of the poetical passage. So when you begin to think about those things, what is the structure? How does a poetical passage, how does the author structure it? Poetry is composed in individual lines to form a series of couplets. Couplets is 2 lines, or what we call tercets, which is 3 lines. I'm hoping that I'm pronouncing that word correctly. Tercets. This is 3 lines together. The reason for this is due to the idea of parallelism within the author's logical flow of thought. We're going to talk more about parallelism and what that means. But again, the structure, by understanding the structure, you're beginning to understand how the author is writing his poetical passage, how he's thinking, his logical flow of thought. Remember in diagramming, when you diagrammed an epistle passage, it helped you to be able to see the logical flow of thought of the author. What was Paul or Peter trying to say, right? Or the author of Hebrews, or James, or John, or Jude. You were able to detect that from looking at a diagram. In a narrative, you had to break it down into scenes and work towards the plot, right? Remember that? You had to see the overall plot of the author, how the author is plotting that out, and how the story is developed. So you want to get to the author's logical flow of thought, but the way it works in a poetical passage is by understanding its structure. And it begins with looking at these couplets or tercets, because those are the framework by which the author is using to express these, what we call parallel ideas. And we'll look at that. Now these couplets are tercets. They're grouped into stanzas. You remember the space in between if you looked above, the end of verse 2, beginning of verse 3, that gap that's there between verses 2 and 3 and verses 4 and 5, those gaps are a visual way to represent the stanzas. They're displayed by the addition of a blank line breaks in many of the modern printed Bibles. The King James Version, however, like I've said before, does not display the poetical genres in that fashion. It would make it difficult for you to visually see that. So in Psalm 1, if you look back at Psalm 1, what you see are 3 stanzas. 3 stanzas. Verses 1 and 2 is a stanza. Verse 3 and 4 is a stanza. Verse 5 and 6 is a stanza. So you have to analyze each stanza. That's your ultimate goal, is to analyze each stanza. Now, don't try to think sermon yet. Some would say, whoa, 3 stanzas, 3 main points. Not necessarily. Remember how I told you not every scene in a narrative is a main point or is a how statement? Some would think 4 scenes, 4 points, 4 house statements. Not at all. It's the same way with the stanzas. You do have to isolate each stanza, examine each stanza, describe each stanza, but all of that information that you will discover will help you put together the what, why, how, and discover the what, why, how. But don't try to think of it as 3 stanzas, 3 house statements. Don't think of it that way. But I want you to visually see that the text is structured in such a way that there are these stanzas, and usually stanzas are the combination of multiple couplets or tercecs together to form a unit. Now, to understand the meaning of any poetical passage, you got to be able to label and describe all the stanzas and the couplets and or tercecs that appear in the passage. You're going to have to label and describe them. Is how this works. Now I want to show you in Psalm 1 how this works. If you look there at Psalm 1, the second image that's on the website or on the notes, you see where it says, "Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked." That's a 2-line couplet. They go together. "Nor stands in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of scoffers." There's another 2-line couplet. "But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law he meditates day and night." That's another 2-line couplet. So, you see over there where it says stanza number 1? So, in stanza number 1, there's 3 2-line couplets. And you have to be able to label and describe each of those 2-line couplets so that you can begin to understand what the stanza is about. Take a look at the next stanza. Now here it gets a little bit interesting. "He is like a tree planted by streams of water." There's a couplet. "That yields its fruit in its season, and its leaf does not wither." That's another couplet. However, the 2 phrases or the 2 lines together, the couplet, "that yields its fruit in its season, and its leaf does not wither," that couplet is combined with the next line, "in all that he does he prospers," and that's your tercec. So when I look at those 3 lines, I first will have to examine the 2 lines together, determine the couplet, and then I'm going to have to ask myself, how does the couplet, how does it relate to the next line? Because now there's a tercec. In verse 4, "The wicked are not so, but are like chaff that the wind drives away." So another couplet. So in this stanza, stanza number 2, I have 3 couplets, but the second couplet also is attached to another line by itself, which makes that a tercec. So I have to examine the couplets. I have to examine every tercec. I have to be able to describe those so that I can arrive at an understanding of the stanza that those couplets and tercecs occupy. And you can see that there's 2 couplets for verses 5 and 6, which makes up stanza number 3. Now, some of this I've discussed with you a little bit in the previous class session, but I just kind of want to make sure you're aware of these things. I'm hoping that you can visually see this. I'm hoping you can visually see the layout. This is what you're going to be working on when we are in our group time together, in our class time together. You're going to be doing this on your passage, your psalm that I've assigned to you. You're going to be beginning the process of going through and looking at each couplet, each tersec, and describing each stanza. So that's the process that we're here to teach you. And we're talking about stanza analysis. When we begin to look at the official procedure for stanza analysis, here's how this works. Stanza analysis is the process by which the exegete, the exegete, it's a two-part process. It's a two-part thing. Number one, you discover the best description for each couplet or tersec in the poetical passage. So we're not worried about the stanza itself at this point. When we're looking at first, what we're going to look at first is we got to understand each couplet and tersec. Then after we've done that, then you will, for each stanza, you will summarize what each stanza represents in accordance with what the author is wanting to communicate to the reader. This is kind of similar to what we did for scenes in narrative, but it's a little bit different. You got to work from the smaller to the larger. You got to start with the details and work to the bigger picture. So, let's start looking at the couplets and tercecs. How do you discover the best description for those? The exegete will need to determine the one word. There's a one-word best description that would help you to be able to express what is the relationship between the lines in the couplets or tercecs. There are relationships. You got to think about it in terms of relationships. How do the lines relate to each other? And this is kind of similar to what you would do with textual observations in a way. But I would say this is a little bit more focused textual observations. Now you're still going to do textual observations on the passage. That comes with looking at figurative language, which we'll talk about in the next video, in the next session. But right now we're looking at just these couplets and tercecs, and when you examine each line and the relationship of each line, you're asking yourself, what is the best definition or description of how these lines relate to each other? So it's all about relationships, the relationships of these lines to each other. So think about it this way. There's some certain ways in which the authors of the Psalms and the poetry passages, certain one-word definitions that keep coming up time and time again. And I'm going to share those with you. And this is what you will use as you think through what is happening in the passage that you've been assigned. Okay, we start with the first one. The idea, the one word is synonymous. Synonymous. All the lines of the couplet are tersec. They have what's called a corresponding meaning. In other words, what is said on the second line, all you're doing is restating the same idea or concept that is inherent in the first line. You're just simply restating it. It's saying that line 2 is synonymous with line 1 of the couplet. Or line 3 is synonymous with lines 1 and 2 together in the tersec. There's no additional information being said here. It's just one equals the other. So for example, in Psalm chapter 2, verse 4, Psalm chapter 2, verse 4, he who sits in the heavens laughs. That's the first line of the couplet. The Lord holds them in derision. So those two lines are two different expressions. Line 1, line 2, that's a couplet. But if you ask yourself, what is the relationship between the two? They're both synonymous. They're saying the same thing. They're saying the same thing. The word he in the first line corresponds to the word Lord in the second line. And the verb laughs corresponds to the phrase hold them in derision, or holds them in derision. And so there's a synonymous idea. There's nothing new being added to line 2. There's nothing in line 2 that adds to line 1 in a sense. It's not new information, but it's synonymous information. Another example is Psalm 23 verse 2. If you look at Psalm 23 verse 2, He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. That's another 2-line couplet. And they're expressing synonymous ideas. He and he refer to the same Lord. Makes me corresponds to leads me. Lies down corresponds to beside. And green pastures corresponds to still waters. Now there's 2 different locations being discussed here, but the essence of what the psalmist is saying is synonymous. Synonymous. Another example is Psalm chapter 7, verse 17. I will give to the Lord the thanks due to His righteousness, and I will sing praises to the name of the Lord, the Most High. These are synonymous statements. I will give corresponds to I will sing. The phrase the thanks corresponds to praise. To His righteousness corresponds to His name. To the Lord corresponds to the phrase of the Lord the Most High. So when you examine these couplets, you have to ask yourself, what kind of relationship do they have with each other? One of the options that you will find used by the authors, especially in the poetry passages or the Psalms of the poetry passages, is synonymous. And when it's synonymous, it means that one is stating the same thing as the other in essence. It's not adding to, it's just restating. And you want to be aware of that. Another way to think about how the lines in a couplet or lines in a teresect may relate to each other, we've looked at synonymous. There's also developmental. And here is where the second line of the couplet, or it could be the third line of a teresect, it adds more information, adds more details to the first line of the couplet, or the first 2-line section of a first 2-line couplet of a teresect. In other words, what the second line says further develops what was stated by the author in the first line of a 2-line couplet, or either the first 2 lines of the couplet that match with or go with a teresect, because there's an additional third line. So the third line adds more information. So that's called developmental. Here's some examples. Psalm 121 verse 3. Psalm 121 verse 3 says here, He will not let your foot be moved. He who keeps you will not slumber. These are not synonymous things. This is developmental. This is an example of a developmental, where line 2 is adding more information to line 1. The words he does correspond to he from line 1 to line 2, but the words keeps you and will not slumber, those that appear in line number 2, they add more details. The idea of keeps you speaks to God's sustaining power, and that's not directly mentioned in the first line. The phrase will not slumber speaks to God's great power, and that's not directly mentioned in the first line as well. So what you have in line number 2 is further development. That's why we call it developmental. Further development, more details that are given in line 2 that add more information. These additional thoughts in the second line will add to the meaning of the statement in the first line, He will not let your foot be moved. So the God who will not let your foot be moved, He will keep you, and He doesn't slumber. He doesn't sleep. Another example is Psalm 31:21. Psalm 31:21 says here, "Blessed be the Lord, for he has wondrously shown his steadfast love to me when I was in a besieged city." That's developmental. The fact that the Lord has wondrously shown his steadfast love to me is an explanation on the proclamation that he is to be blessed. The inclusion of the term "for" provides the reason why the psalmist says that the Lord is to be blessed by his people. So line 2 relates to line 1 in the couplet in adding more information, developing line 1 in a more extensive way by what is contained in line 2 of the couplet. Psalm 119 verse 9. How can a young man keep his way pure? He's asking the question, how can a young man keep his way pure? By guarding it according to your word. That famous psalm, Psalm 119, this is one of the verses from that psalm. It's also one of the couplets from that psalm. So the second line answers the question that's posed in the first line. His way corresponds to it, but the how is answered by the terms guarding according to your word. So there may be some corresponding ideas, but it's not purely synonymous. There are developmental ideas in that line 2 is developing more extensively what was written in line 1. So we have synonymous and developmental. The next category is illustrative. Here is where the second line of the couplet, or the third line of a teresect, expands the meaning of the first line. It does develop it, but it does it in a unique way. It does it by illustrating it with an example or a symbol. So you may confuse what would be classified as illustrative. You may actually think it's developmental, and you wouldn't be totally incorrect. But what we're wanting you to think through is what is the best one-word description of how the lines relate to each other. The use of illustration is like developmental. It's like it, but it's a more specific way the psalmist can use to express that developmental type of relationship. He's expanding on the meaning of it by illustrating. Psalm 140 verse 7. Psalm 140 verse 7. O Lord, my Lord, the strength of my salvation, you have covered my head in the day of battle. Now, that is clearly developmental, but it's also can be classified as illustrative. So you don't write developmental, illustrative. You don't state it that way. Just put illustrative. You'll understand what illustrative is. You'll understand that it relates to developmental, but you don't have to actually write that out. Just say illustrative. O Lord, my Lord corresponds to the you in the second line. Covered my head in the day of battle. It does provide more information, but it provides literally an illustration of how the strength of my salvation is understood by the psalmist. He is expanding and providing more details, but he's doing it in the form of illustrating. Now, another example of the illustrative category is Psalm 131, verse 2. So when you look at Psalm 131, verse 2, the psalmist writes, "But I have calmed and quieted my soul, like a weaned child with its mother, like a weaned child is my soul within me." So in that psalm, it's clearly illustrative. The phrase, like a weaned child with its mother, illustrates what the psalmist means by being calm and quieted my soul. So I've calmed and quieted my soul like a weaned child with its mother. That he's using that illustration to try to give an idea of how he is in terms of his soul being calmed and quieted. What's interesting is that the phrase, like a weaned child is my soul within me, it's synonymous since this is a teresect, it's synonymous with the first and second lines together, even though there's some repetition. It shows a synonymous idea. But the point I wanted you to see is that the illustrative concept is used by the author in Psalm 131, verse 2, in that way. So he's giving further development, but it's also more specifically an illustration. So you got to think that it could be illustrative. Psalm 130, verse 6. Here's another one. My soul waits for the Lord more than the watchman for the morning. More than the watchman for the morning. More than watchman for the morning, the second line, it illustrates waiting for the Lord. Now you got to be able to understand what that type of illustration means. What is the illustration about? That's when you examine it at a deeper level. And we'll look at that later. But initially, what is the relationship between the two? Here, it's illustrative. And like in the other example, more than watchman in the morning is synonymous with the first and second lines together, even though it's a directed, repeated statement of the second line. So when you're looking at these couplets and teresects, you have to ask yourself, what is the relationship between them? What is the relationship between them? Now, another way that you can view these lines that the authors would be writing their statements is the idea of contrastive. So we look at synonymous, developmental, illustrative, now contrastive. This is where the second line of the couplet, or third line of a teresect, is set in contrast to the meaning of the first line. And the conjunction but, B-U-T, that you would, when you're making textual observations, you would see that, is normally used to highlight that contrast. Now, this often consists of a restatement of the idea of the first line by asserting its opposite in that both lines state the same idea, but may be stated in opposite ways. So in a sense, it's like reverse synonymous. In a sense, they're synonymous, but they're contrasting. So they're really not the same, they're different. But they're trying to state one against the other, one in opposition to the other. Here's a good example. Psalm 1:6. Psalm chapter 1, verse 6. The Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish. So you can see the contrast there. The way of the righteous is in contrast to the way of the wicked. Now, the way and the way are corresponding, but they're two different ways. They're not the synonymous ways. There's the way of the righteous. That's not the same as the way of the wicked. Will perish is in contrast, is the contrast result of that which is implied by the first line. So the way of the righteous leads to one place, the way of the wicked leads to perishing. The conjunction but, B-U-T, appears in the couplet. That word helps you to visually see that there's a contrast taking place. Psalm 145:20 is another example. All who love the Lord is in contrast with the wicked. They represent two different groups of people. And the idea of preserves is in contrast with destroy, will destroy. And the conjunction but appears in the couplet. It highlights that contrast. So when you see a contrast, that should make it easy, right? When you see the word but, that'll make it pretty easy. It could be contrastive without that conjunction there, but in most cases, that conjunction will show up, and that'll tell you that it's contrasting. And you could have, in a teresect, the first two lines could be synonymous or developmental or illustrative, but then it could contrast with the third line. I didn't provide an example of that in our video here, but you can maybe find an example like that in the poetical passages. So you have synonymous, developmental, illustrative, contrasting. Those are your four main categories. You say only 4? Yeah, only 4. However, there may be some couplets or tercets that just doesn't fall exactly into those categories. And so we have a category called the formal category. The formal category. This is that which category that is used when none of the other ones fit. The type of relationship that we've been describing. Now, this category should only be used when the exegete fully realizes that none of the other categories will fit, that can be used to describe the relationship that exists in the couplet or tercet. This category will not appear many times. Okay? You're not going to be finding this too much. You shouldn't. It may be a few times to either none. But if you do use if you say, I think it's the formal category, I think that's what's being used, then the exegete must attempt to discern what type of relationship the author is using, since the other 4 categories don't apply. So you need to try to define it. Now, what I do here is I have this little thing where it says formal dash question mark, question mark, question mark. The question marks symbol represents the best description word that you believe describe the relationship of the couplet or tercet. Now, don't say formal dash illustrative. You wouldn't do it that way. You would just say illustrative. If whatever you use to describe the formal relationship, it has to be something different than the 4 categories that we've looked at. That's why you would put it down as formal. Otherwise, you can use one of the 4 categories. And the majority of the times that you are describing or identifying the relationship of the couplets and tercets, the majority of the times, 95 to 98% of the time, you're going to use one of those 4 categories. But on the chance or the time that would come where you would say it's formal, you need to take it a step further and begin to try to describe it, maybe in one word, couple of words, whatever that may be. So you want to think about it in that way. So there's really 4 main categories with an additional one that's kind of the one that's the catch-all if none of the other 4 match. So when you're doing stanza analysis, that's the first thing to do, is identify the relationships of the couplets and tercets. Couplets and tercets. Now, if you look at the bottom of the web page, you'll see that we have an example here. And the passage that I'm going to be using throughout the course is Psalm 3. I haven't assigned Psalm 3 to any of you. I'm eventually going to have a sermon on Psalm 3. And that'll be posted later in the course. And so all the assignments that we do, I will use Psalm 3 as my example. And if you look at this, you see that there are actually 5 stanzas in this psalm. Stanzas 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And if you look at stanza number 1, you have 2 couplets. Verse 1 is a couplet. Verse 2 is a couplet. And it says, "O Lord, how many are my foes? Many are rising against me." When I look at those 2 lines together, and I'm asking myself, trying to identify what is the relationship between the 2, I describe that one as synonymous. Synonymous. And you see how I wrote this. I wrote the passage, and then to the right of it, I wrote what the one-word description, and then I drew arrows to the 2 phrases that are the couplet. Notice the next verse, verse 2. "Many are saying of my soul, there is no salvation for him in God." And that's clearly a developmental. Where the phrase, "there is no salvation for him in God," is adding more information to the first line, "Many are saying of my soul." So I wrote it out that way. Why do I visually put it this way? Because that's how you will do it on your assignment. On your assignment. You will have to go through and write out the passage, write out the biblical passage in poetry format. Poetry format with lines and indent the lines, put gaps between the stanzas, just as you would see it. And then when you label and identify the couplet or teresect, you will write that out and draw arrows. Now, there's another word that shows up, and you'll see it here, Selah. We're going to talk about that later in the course. But if you see that, just write it out like it is, like I do in this example. Your psalm may have that. That word may appear. It may not appear. But we'll talk about what Selah means and how significant that is to the exegetical process, okay? We'll talk about that in a future lesson. But when you're going to do stanza analysis, that's the first thing you do. So I want you to write your passage out. There's a place in the workbook to do that. I'll describe that in a little bit. But I want you to write your passage, and then you got to label and identify the couplets. That's something you need to get started working on before we have our second class meeting together. Now, once you do that, then you can begin to summarize each stanza. Now, this is not going to be a full summary because all you've done is define the relationships of lines with each other. There's still more to the exegetical process, but you're going to summarize each stanza. So to best do that, the exegete will need to think through each of the couplets, each of the teresects that exist within a stanza. And what you will do is you will summarize the stanzas by composing a series of statements that best explain the flow of the author's logical argument. You'll have a series of statements. The summarizing process of each stanza, however, will continue throughout the exegetical process as more information is learned by the exegete. So, after you do the next session is going to be on figurative language, textual observations. You're going to do that assignment. You will re-summarize each of the stanzas. So you'll begin with an initial summary, and you'll expand on the summary as we go through the full exegetical procedure. So in a sense, you're going to continue to do stanza analysis. Now, you're not going to have to do the couplets and the teresects. That's what you're working on right now. That's the first element. That's the first part of it. But as you work on looking at the figures of speech, you'll do significant words. Every time you do another step in the exegetical process for poetical genre, you will add to your summaries of each stanza and how it's developed. You'll understand more of the author's logical flow of thought, and you'll be able to best explain it and summarize. So, for example, if you look at below the Psalm 3 passage, you will see that I've begun to summarize each stanza. And there's not a lot of statements here. And I'm writing these statements in paragraph format, not outline format. You could write them in outline format like we used to do for scene analysis, but I like writing them in paragraph format, maybe for the way it just saves space. But I wrote for stanza number 1, David, the psalmist, states that he has many who are against him. These enemies believe and say to others that God is not going to save David anymore. Now, as I learn more about the meaning of the words in those phrases, Psalm 3 verses 1 and 2, the first stanza, my stanza analysis will grow. It'll become more developed as we go along. So this is not how my summary will exist in its final form. More will come along. And as we go through the exegetical process, you're going to see that. Now, here's what I want you to do. I want you, after watching this video and going through and looking at the example that I provide, Psalm 3, I want you to take the time, take about an hour or so, and I want you to work on the stanza analysis, the initial stanza analysis for the passage that I've assigned you. I want you to label each of the couplets. If you have a teresect, label it. I want you to think it through the best you can. This doesn't have to be perfect. I want you to make your example look similar to what it looks like in the example. And I provided pages for you, page 14 and 15. Page 14 is the real one, the one you're going to write this on up. And you can always use the back page, and you can always use extra pages in your notebook. But I want you to work at this. And you need to bring this to class. Bring this to our classroom session for week number 2. My assumption is it may not be perfect. It doesn't matter. I want you to at least attempt it. I want you to spend 1 hour, at least 1 hour, working on this, maybe even 2. Working on the passage, writing it out and labeling it. And do it in pencil. Don't do it in ink or ballpoint pen. Do it in pencil so that you can erase. And when you come to class, bring an eraser and bring your pencil. Because what we're going to do in class is we're going to divide you into groups. When we meet for week number 2, I'm going to divide you into groups, and I'm going to give you some passages. And you as a group are going to do a stanza analysis. We're going to talk through any questions you may have. We're going to work through some various passages, and I'm going to give you some time to finish your assignment in class so that what you bring to class, you'll be able to finalize. And then you'll give it to me before you leave, or give it to your professor before you leave. That's how we're going to work this. That's how we're going to operate. And so I want you to be able to go ahead and get started working on your assignment. After watching the video, give it the best attempt possible. And what we're going to do in class is give you more opportunities to complete the process, ask questions, and really be able to understand how this works. Okay? So hopefully this is a good introduction to stanza analysis and helps you in beginning the process. So take the passage that I've already assigned to you, the psalm that I've already assigned to you, and I want you to begin doing your stanza analysis on it and follow the example that's here on the web page.